Thank you so much, Joe, for the kind introduction and kind invitation, and also to Thermo Fisher One Lambda for the opportunity to present on our experience using the ExPlex Single Antigen Bead panel. So as Joe mentioned, I'm from Halifax in Canada, and as you can see in the summer, we do here a lot of relaxation and a lot of fishing. Here's my disclosure slide. So Halifax is a beautiful city on the Atlantic coast of Canada, and this is what it looks like in August. But unfortunately, 6 months out of the year, Halifax looks more like this, and I think the rest of the country looks very similar. So my boys are a lot taller than me, and you see that this probably would have taken us 3 to 4 hours to take all the snow out of the driveway. So that's our winter. So winter and the weather, is one of our challenges here in Canada. And the other challenge that we face is the geography. You see that Canada is the second largest country in the world, but has a very sparse population, less than 10% of what you have in Europe. And in this vast land, we have 5.5 time zones and 13 transplant centers that are spread across the country. And here I am right in Halifax, where we have a unique system where it's a multi-provincial system. So 4 provinces, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, we all are part of the same transplant system. And Halifax is the only laboratory here that performs HLA testing for this population. And so you can imagine that if you're trying to ship organs across the country, this is logistically difficult. And so we've done a lot of work in Canada to really try to align our assays to make sure that when we do ship organs and transplant patients, that it's very rare that our cross matches are unexpectedly positive when we ship an organ, say, from Vancouver here in British Columbia to Halifax. And so, prior to 2009 in Canada, we really only had provincial transplant systems, and there was really no organ sharing at that time. And then since 2009, we've been working together to implement some national registries. And the first one was the kidney paired exchange. And then in 2013, we launched the highly sensitized patient registry for those with calculated PRA of 95 or above. And this really coincided with major improvement in HLA antibody testing technology and HLA typing. So you see that all labs in Canada phased out serology and CDC testing, and we all now type at all clinically relevant loci using molecular techniques, either real-time PCR or XR SSO for the deceased donor typing. And so this is really at a single antigen bead resolution. And in my center, in fact, we type all patients and the deceased donor retrospectively using next generation sequencing. And that's going to be very important for epitope analysis and assignment of, accurate assignment of antibodies and for virtual cross-matching. All centers have implemented flow cytometry cross-match, and we've really worked together to try to standardize how we perform this type of test. So again, we don't have a lot of unexpected, false positive or negative reactions. And of course, again, we aligned our solid phase assay testing. We've done a lot of studies to ensure that, from center to center, our test results look very similar, because that's extremely important for virtual cross-matching and then being able to predict whether certain donor is going to be compatible with a highly sensitized patient. And so virtual cross-matching, I'm sure, as everyone knows, can be a challenge. It really is only as accurate and as complete as the HLA antibody information and HLA antibody typing, and HLA typing information. So again, doing granular antibody analysis and HLA typing it as high resolution as you can is very helpful. There are also limitations of solid phase assays, as you know, complement-mediated interference. There are some denatured epitopes. And again, labs and centers around the world have different ways of trying to deal with this, including, for example, serum treatment here with EDTA or heat or DTT. Interpretation is a challenge. So if you send the same data to several laboratories, you may get very different interpretation of the results. And again, in Canada, we've worked quite a bit on trying to align our approaches to antibody interpretation. And again, as I mentioned, high resolution typing is really important. But today we'll talk a little bit about the representation of different alleles that may be present in the donor population on the single antigen bead panels and how ExPlex can actually enhance that. And so here's some allele frequency data from North America, and you see the standard class 1 single antigen bead panel is covering a lot of common alleles and some less common alleles here under 1% for A, B, and C loci. And here's the same information for class 2 loci. So again, a lot of the common alleles are covered by the standard panel. But when you look at what's not represented on the standard panel, you see that there are some relatively common alleles that are actually not covered by the standard panel. For example, A0205, B3502 and 03, 3802, C0701, C0802. I mean, these are pretty common alleles. They're not on the standard single antigen bead panel. And here you see the same information for class 2 alleles. So, for example, DQ beta 0503, DR1302. These are quite commonly seen in our donor population, and they're not represented on the standard panel. When you look at the ExPlex panel, then you see that a lot of these alleles that are actually named, that are common, they're actually covered on the ExPlex panel for class 1. And here's the same information for class 2, so 0503 for the DQ beta, and DRB 1302 is covered as well, which is quite helpful. And some other alleles that we commonly see here, are still not on any of the panels, and would be probably useful to have some of these covered on some panels, and this is for class 2. And so this is the list of alleles that are present on the ExPlex panel. And ExPlex panel, the way you use it, you can either use it on its own, or you can actually combine the standard panel beads and the ExPlex panel beads together, and then you add double the amount of serum that you would normally use in testing, but then the rest of the assay is really the same as the standard panel testing. And so now I'll talk about some cases that we identified in my lab here in Halifax, where you'll see that using the ExPlex panel is very useful to sort these cases out. And I try to name these cases so they kind of stick in your memory, so in my memory for sure. So the first case I called missing in action. I hope you'll see why that is in a second. So this is a case of a young male patient with end-stage renal disease who had a previous renal transplant from a deceased donor, and the transplant failed after several years. And now this patient was relisted on the deceased donor wait list. And here you see some of the HLA antibody specificities that this patient currently has following this transplant. And you see that actually makes sense. A DR17 antibody, an allele-specific DR52 antibody, and you see that the previous donor was in fact DR17 positive, and we only have AB and DR serology typing available because the transplant was quite remote. And when you see at the single antigen bead testing, looking at the standard panel, you see this antibody reactivity with the alleles and antigens that are already mentioned. And we always in Halifax try to use epitope analysis to see whether these truly represent a real sensitization. Typically, these fall into some kind of an epitope pattern. And you see that indeed, most of this reactivity can be explained by two eplets. One is called 37N, and the other one is called 51R2. And you see that the DR17 here, for example, which is the immunizing antigen, and DR52 are both represented in one of these eplets. And what I should also point out here is that one of the antibodies that we identified here is the allele-specific antibody against DRB1 1301. So it's listed here. And of course, as luck would have it, one of the first donors that was proposed for this particular patient, deceased donors, you see the typing here with all the alleles that are mismatched are indicated in red. And you see that the donor types as DRB1 1302, which is actually missing from the standard panel. And again, when you go back to the standard panel, you see the 1301 is positive and 1303 is negative. And so how do you now predict whether we are going to have this reactivity? An epitope analysis can be useful, because when you look at the eplets, you see that this epitope 37N contains both 1301, which is the reactive allele on the single antigen panel, and 1302, which is not represented on the standard panel, but not 1303. So we would predict that in this particular case, the virtual cross-match should be positive, and that's what we told our physicians. And in fact, we performed flow cytometry cross-match, and the B cell cross-match was weakly positive, as you would expect. But you see that if you actually had the ExPlex panel in this particular case, and we ran that retrospectively, you see that in fact we would have known this information. So the 1302 allele here, as predicted, is reacting in this particular case. So next case, I named the merrier, and this is also a case of a highly sensitized patient who had 2 previous pregnancies as sensitizing events, and now she has a PRA of 100%, and this is a deceased donor that's being proposed for this particular patient. And you see here at class 1, there are only 2 mismatches, 3801 and 1203 for the C locus. And when you run a standard single antigen bead panel, and we always make sure that we highlight patients' own antigens here to kind of determine maybe where the background reactivity may be starting, we see that in fact the donor-specific mismatches, the B3801 and 1203, are kind of in the lower range here. The 1203 is really negative, but the 3801 is weakly positive. So, how do you determine whether this is a real reactivity or just part of some kind of a background? And the MFI here is way under 1,000 MFI, which is kind of what we use as some kind of a cutoff to facilitate the analysis and put some kind of a guide for our technologists to analyze antibodies. Well, again, we perform eplet analysis. And when you do this in this particular case, you see that most of this reactivity is explained by 2 eplets, and that explains the A locus and B locus reactivity. But 3801 is not explained by that. But there's another epitope called 158T, which includes B38, 39, and 67, and those specificities are highlighted in red. So this really suggests that this is a real epitope and probably, result of some kind of a real sensitization. But what is interesting is when you run that same case on the ExPlex panel, now instead of just having 3 beads that are positive for the antigens that carry this epitope, you see that there are 6 more beads that carry this epitope, and all of those beads are actually positive. And so that gives you a lot more confidence now to say, yeah, this truly is a real antibody, a real sensitization event. And even if you were going to potentially cross it, from the clinical perspective, the clinical team should be aware that this is a real antibody and not just some kind of a background. And I think having a lot more beads with these alleles on the panels will give you more confidence to call these antibodies in such cases. So the next case I wanted to present is called guilty by association. And so again, we have a highly sensitized patient with pregnancies as previous sensitizing events. And so here's the class 1 single antigen bead panel that we see for this patient. So you do see a lot of reactivities here. And basically all these antibodies, when you perform eplet analysis, can be explained by 2 eplets. And in particular, the B and C locus is explained by this eplet that really is the signature BW6 epitope. The eplet is called 80N. And what you see is that in this case, normally you just assign potentially all the C locus specificities as unacceptable antigens because they're part of the reactivity pattern. But when you run the ExPlex panel, an interesting pattern emerges. So you see that one of the reactivities that is in positive range is C1601. But when you look here at the 1602, the allele that's not present on the standard panel, but is present on the ExPlex panel, it's completely negative. So in fact, if you assign C16 as an unacceptable antigen, you would potentially be denying this patient a transplant from perfectly well, compatible donor if the donor was expressing 1602. And why is this significant in this case? Well, and before I even go there, you see that the 80N epitope, in fact, is expressed by the 1601 allele, which is positive and is part of the standard panel, but the 1602 allele does not express this epitope. So that clearly, explains the reactivity here. But the reason this is also important is that in this particular case, this patient does not have any reactivity against B51 antigen. As many of you probably know, B51 is commonly associated through linkage disequilibrium with C16. And when you look at how commonly it is associated with 1602 allele versus 1601 allele, it's about twice as often. So again, by calling C16, you'd really be doing disservice to the patient because you'd be denying them NA1602, a transplantation from NA1602 donors who are B51. And, you know, based on Canadian frequency, we would be probably expecting 2 to 3 donors a year like that would probably match this patient. So it's, again, very important to use, you know, this extra allele information when you're performing virtual cross matches and when you're calling unacceptable antigens. Next case is called ignorance is bliss. So this is kind of a reverse case. So here we have a patient that is kind of moderately sensitized, and here is a deceased donor that's being considered for this patient. And in our lab, we have recently switched from doing XR SSO typing. We do it now by real-time single antigen bead resolution PCR typing. But you see here that the donor is typed as C16, and you cannot really distinguish between 1601 and 1602 based on this particular panel. And when we perform testing on this patient's serum using the ExPlex panel, now we kind of see the reverse situation where the allele of the 1601, which is present on the standard panel, is negative, but the 1602 is positive. And that makes sense because 1602 expresses the alternative epitope called 80K, which is expressed on a bunch of HLA-C locus specificities, including 1602. And so now, you know, the question is our donor 1601 or 1602? Now, the typing wasn't able to tell us that, but when you perform haplotype association assessment, you'd determine very quickly that 1601, in fact, which is the non-reactive allele, is more than 100 times more likely in linkage disequilibrium with B4403, which is what this donor is expressing. And so we're pretty confident that we should be able to go to transplantation safely. Flow cytometry cross matches were performed and they were completely negative. Patient went to transplant, then we retrospectively confirmed by NGS that in fact this donor was 1601 positive and not 1602. Next case is called the great imposter. And so here you have a highly sensitized patient with a history of previous kidney transplant. And here's the deceased donor typing. Again, this was a remote transplant, so the typing was just done at ABDR by serology. And so here's the class 1 HLA antibody pattern for this patient. And you see that part of the reactivity is this CW7 bead, but patient types CW7. So are you going to call this an unacceptable antigen? Well, of course, the allele that is represented on the standard single antigen bead panel, and that's the only allele of the C7 antigen group, is 0702. And as you can imagine, the patient's actually C0701. And this reactivity here against C7 is actually a real reactivity. As you can see, it is well explained by this 76V, 77S eplet, which includes one of the B locus specificities here. And when you run the ExPlex single antigen bead panel, again, you clearly see that C0702 is reacting, and the 0701, which is patient's own allele, is not reactive. So this actually makes perfect sense. And this 0702 antibody is a real antibody, but it's a little allele-specific antibody. In fact, in Halifax, in our multi-organ transplant program database, where we enter antibody information on the patients, we have a special tool that if the antibody matches what the patient's typing is at the antigen level, that antibody is turned off from being unacceptable, even if you were to enter it by accident, so that mistakes like this, potential mistakes, if C7 is an antibody that you're detecting, and that's the only allele, and then the patient has, you know, the alternate allele, that is not going to allow this antigen to be listed as an unacceptable antigen for the patient. But I'm not sure how many centers have kind of safety checks like this in place. And ExPlex analysis here clearly shows that this is not an antigen level antibody. It's not an autoantibody. This is really an allele-specific antibody. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about some DP alleles. So as you probably know, most of the DP reactivities can be explained by, you know, a couple of cross-reactive areas within DP beta sequence. And so, you know, when we were establishing our Canadian transplant registry and virtual cross-matching, we're always saying, well, if we have one of these DP molecules that are not covered on the panel, where we can predict whether the crossmatch should be positive or not based on the epitopes that all the other DP reactivities carry, and then predict that. But so now that we have the ExPlex panel, we can actually test that hypothesis, and it's really nice to see that some of these alleles that in the past we were just predicting whether the antibody should bind or not. In fact, the antibodies do bind them, and they do come up positive. So here's a nice example of the 56A epitope. And you see that we were able to, by looking at this patient who has this particular antibody that's targeting this epitope, you're able to see that the DP 30, 31, 40, 85, and 107 that are not part of the standard panel are in fact reacting. And here's not a case with a patient who has a 55 through 57 DEE epitope, and that is expressed by the DP beta 10501 allele. So I'll conclude here my portion of the presentation. So I hope that I showed you that the ExPlex panel can be very useful and improves virtual cross-matching, and that we now have most common alleles that we encounter in our donor population covered between the standard and the ExPlex allele. Using this ExPlex panel refines HLA antibody assignment and allows you to call some of these allele-specific antibodies, and you're not confusing them with autologous reactions, for example. The epitope analysis in our experience is enhanced, and again you see that we can refine CPRA calculation to better reflect the matchability. So we've been fishing for many years, and all of us use these standard baits, but if you want to become more proficient at fishing, you really have to use better bait. So I'll just quickly thank the lab here, the Halifax HLA lab, especially my co-director, Dr. Anna Greenshields, one of the chief technologists, Kim Johansson-Dino, Jeff Adams, and Kelly Heinstein, who is our supervisor. And now I just wanted to quickly introduce my friend and collaborator, Dr. Sandra Tafulo. When we were talking about using ExPlex connecting or comparing notes, I showed her some of the cases that I just shared with you. And, I thought that I would really impress, her with those cases. But then she showed me some of the cases that she's seen in the lab, and they really blew me away. So I'm sure that she's going to blow you away with those cases as well. And so without further ado, I'll give the sharing screen rights to Sandra.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Joe. And I also want to thank One Lambda for the opportunity to present here a few cases from our laboratory. So this is my disclosure. So the presentation is mine and does not necessarily reflect the policy or position of One Lambda or Thermo Fisher. And as Rob mentioned, he tried to name all his cases, and he also named my cases. So I have a series of stealth bomber cases that you are going to see in a minute why this name was chosen. So this is the stealth bomber case number 1. This is patient typing and previous donor typing with the HLA mismatches highlighted in red. This is single antigen bead standard kit assay, and we can see also the donor mismatches highlighted, and we can see perfectly the donor mismatches are in fact the highest reactivity seen for A locus and B locus. So everything seems to be in accordance. But when we tested the ExPlex, for our surprise, we identified the B35 with more than 2000 MFI. And patient was B35, previous donor was B35, but in fact, patient is a B3501 and the previous donor was a B3502. So this was antibody against this first donor that we never detected or reported as a DSA because we did not have this extended panel to test it with. So this is the analysis with infusion that we can do the analysis together of the standard and this ExPlex kit. And we can see with no doubts that this 3502 is positive, while the patient bead is completely negative. And in fact, there is, if we do the sequence alignment, we can see that there is a position that where B3502 differs from the other 35 within this kit, and this justifies this allele-specific reactivity. So with the use of the ExPlex for this case, we were able to update our unacceptable HLA antigen list to include this 3502 as unacceptable. It will also allow us to accurately monitor the assay in the future that we couldn't do for these patients after this first transplant. So that's why these cases are called stealth bomber, because we couldn't really detect these antibodies using the standard kit alone. So go to the stealth bomber case number 2. This is a male patient in the waiting list for a third transplant. Mismatches are also highlighted in red. First donor is only typed for AB by serology because it's from the 90s. And the second donor was already typed by molecular methods. Then this is standard single antigen bead assay, and we can see that we have reactivity against first donor A24, B51, the second donor A1, A3. We cannot explain the C15 reactivity, but we don't have the C locus of this donor. We can predict, and this C15 could be associated with a B51 and be, in fact, the assay against this first donor. But when we did the ExPlex, for our surprise, we detected this C701 that we couldn't see in the standard kits. And this is, in fact, an allele-specific reactivity. And in the standard kit, we only have the 702. 704 is also negative, but 701 is positive. And if you go back to the typing, this second donor was already typed by NGS. We could see that this second donor was a 701. So this was a DSA against this first donor, probably also against the second donor, and probably also against this first donor, but we never detected the C7 as DSA. Or was it now listed for this third transplant? And if we check the sequence alignments, we can again detect the position where this C701 differs from the other 7s within the kits, and shares this position with the C1502 and 05 that we saw to be positive for this patient. So again, we couldn't see this reactivity using only the standard kit, and using the extended, we were able to update the unacceptable antigen list for this patient to include the C701. And again, it will also allow us to monitor correctly the DSA in the future when he got another transplant. So this is stealth bomber number 3, also a male in the waiting list for a second transplant. This is patient typing, previous donor typing. This is standard single antigen bead assay, and highlighted are the mismatch of this donor. And we did not highlight this B45 as a mismatch because, at least in Portugal, we consider a match when we have a broad match. So they are both B12s. This was considered a match, the B45. But when we did the ExPlex, for our surprise, we detected a B45 that is positive. So we went back to the standard kit and we checked again, and the B45 was completely negative. But in fact, here in the ExPlex, this is the B5002. While in the standard kit, the bead represented is a B4501. And in fact, there is two positions where the 5002 differs from 4501. But I also wanted to point out that there is also a position where B52 5002 is equal to B45, and they both differ from 5001. So we really can have both situations. And until we saw this, we used to translate to phenotypic typing. When we saw a donor that was a B5002, we translate to the phenotype, so to B45, and we would do the matching with this P45. But this really opened our eyes, and we cannot include 2 or 3 unacceptable per loci, as I know other countries can, but at least we always take in consideration the possibility of the patient can have B50 antibodies as well. And this is the analysis with the standard and ExPlex together, where we can see perfectly the B5001 and 5002 that is represented as B45 positive and B4501 that is negative. So this case allowed us to include B5002 as unacceptable for this patient, and really open our eyes to include both B50 and B45 as an acceptable mismatch when we have a B5002 donor. And this is stealth bomber case number 4. This is also a male with a previous donor in the waiting list for a second transplant, kidney transplant. Highlighted are the previous donor mismatches, and we can see we have A11 reactivity, B44. We don't have the C typing for this donor, but we can predict, and it is most probably a C5, and in fact the highest reactivity for this patient is a C5 against this first donor. But when we did the ExPlex, we identified 2 beads of C8, C802 and C804, with the MFI value close to the MFI value detected for the C5. And in fact, the standard kit already had a C8 within the panel, but it's a C801, but it only has, for this serum, 1600 MFI. So this would be very different for risk assessment, and probably also the wet cross matches results that would be very different if we have a donor that is a C801 or a C802. And in fact, this different C8s can be justified by 2 different eplets. So the use of the ExPlex allowed us to identify this eplet 138K. That is against the first donor, and we considered as unacceptable in the future, while the C8 and this other reactivity that is explained by this other C alleles, we considered as positive but permissive, because as you can see, this patient doesn't have a lot of C possibilities, and the PRA, calculated PRA, would be very high. But in this case, I also wanted to show you, because I don't know if you remember, that this patient was a C7 17 that are completely negative here in the standard panel as predicted. But if we look closer to the ExPlex kit, we also see a C7 that is positive, that we could not detect in the standard kit. So this is a allele-specific reactivity that we were not also able to see with the standard kit alone. And there is also another thing that I wanted to show you in this case, is that again we have the B45 positive in this ExPlex, that you already know that this B45 is a 5002, But in this case, we have the opposite. So now the B5001 is negative and 4501 is positive. So this is the other way around. So we really have to take in consideration both B45 and B52 as unacceptable for donors 5002. So this case, we were able to, besides listing C704 that we couldn't see with the standard, it allowed us to accurately do the eplet analysis, identifying this weaker permissive eplet with C801 and C803 versus this donor-specific eplet that includes the C5 and C802 and 04 that should be considered as unacceptable. And this is the last stealth bomber case. It's a patient in the waiting list for the 5th transplant, although he's only 37 years old. He already had 4 previous transplants. And this is the standard kit assay, where we have reactivities against donor 2 and DR11 against donor 4. And all DQ7, DQ3, all DQ3 positivity. But when we did the ExPlex, for our surprise, we detected this 1302. And if we go back to the standard kit, this is the analysis of standard and ExPlex together, we can see that only 1302 is positive, while the other 2 beads that are present in the standard kit are negative. So we would completely miss the DR13 as unacceptable for this patient. So this is why these cases were called stealth bomber, and because we all have seen allele-specific reactivity within the standard, but the ExPlex really allow us to expand that analysis. And with this, I go to the 2 final cases that were called also by Rob a needle in a haystack, and that's because these are very rare cases, but they can happen. And this is a female patient in a waiting list for a 1st transplant. The only sensitizing event she has is pregnancies, and what we could see in the standard kit was a pan HLA-A reactivity. But could this really be a pan A reactivity? Could this patient be forming antibodies against all A loci? So our first step was to type patients by NGS, and we found that she was A205, and the A2 present within the standard kit are the A201, A203, and 06. So we did the ExPlex that includes others A2, but also the A205, and we could see with no doubt that the bead O205 was completely negative. That was in concordance with our typing. So in fact, this is not a pan-reactivity, but we just couldn't see the whole picture using the standard kit alone. And this really opened our eyes, because this can happen in reverse. We can have antibodies only against O205 and O201, O202, and not these other A-loci or A2 antibodies. And if the patient has antibodies against A205 only, we completely would miss this using the standard kit alone. And this is the final case, of a needle in a haystack, that we also saw a pan-reactivity, but now in the DP-B1 loci. And we were a little questioning if this was really a DP reactivity, or this DP4, DP23 could be a higher background and be probably negative. So we also did the patient NGS typing that confirmed that she is a DPB1 HLA-DP0202 that is not within the standard panel, but we did the ExPlex and we confirmed that this patient is not pan-DP reactivity, but in fact this was seen like that in the standard because this DPV0202 is not represented in the standard kit. And we also did the eplet analysis, and we could see that these DP4, DP23 are explained by this eplet 35F that is also in these other reactivities, but these others also share these other two higher risk eplets. So as it's extremely difficult to find a donor homozygous for DPV1022, we call these two DP as possible permissive because of their being weaker than the other DP reactivity with very high MFI. So just to conclude, I hope my cases showed us that the importance of high resolution typing is of extremely importance, and the use of the extended single antigen bead panel because it improved the HLA antibody identification at allele level, enhancing HLA eplet analysis, refining the assignment of HLA antibody specificity and assignment of unacceptable antigens for these patients in the waiting list, improving the accuracy of virtual cross-matching, but it also helped clarifying pan-reactivity patterns that were not really pan-reactive, and will allow us to enhance DSA monitoring for these patients after transplant. And with this, I finish, and I'll be available for questions.